Hey guys, welcome to Tech Talk Live number 99. Today we're going to be joined by Dave Draper, who is our senior software engineer. He's been with Alfresco for, I believe, 6 years now, maybe going a little bit later. Okay. And he is going to be doing a demonstration and kind of going over some of the core concepts of development in Aikau and a small comparison as to how that works in regard to, or in contrast to ADF. I did want to start with some announcements. I guess I should introduce myself for anybody that I haven't met yet. I'm Kristen Gastaldo. I am the Alfresco community manager, so I am managing that space that we sit up and jive for you guys to ask questions and check out the blogs and connect with other members. So if you have any questions in regards to the community, you can always just reach me there, or you can reach me on Skype as well at kristen.gastaldo. Having a little toolbox issue, so I don't have my cheat sheet for how to connect with me, but you guys can find me in the community anytime. So Francesco Corti is also joining us today. He is our new developer evangelist. If you guys haven't met him yet, he'll do his own intro, but just that's who's on the call today. We are bringing back regularly scheduled office hours and Tech Talk Lives. Our next Tech Talk Live is actually Tech Talk Live number 100. So we kind of toyed around with the idea of doing a big, a special event around number 100, but I think what we might do is do a regular Tech Talk Live and then spend our next office hours discussing the journey for what we've been doing with Tech Talk Lives the last few years and kind of reminiscing about what we've done, and then get some feedback from you guys about where we'd like to go from here. So let's go ahead and get started. We have a pretty full itinerary today. So Francesco, if you want to take over.
Okay, thank you, Kristen. Hi, guys. I would like to show something because I'm trying to share with you some brief content. I won't take more than 5 minutes because I would like to see if it's interesting for you to see what happened since the last Tech Talk Live. So 1 month until today, what happened around the Alfresco ecosystem. Of course, we don't talk about what happens in serious things, but we prefer to talk about geek things, and especially if we talk about Alfresco, of course, the Order of the Bee, and the whole community of developers around this open source project and platform. So let's start. I would like to start with the 14th of October when Kevin Rost shared that Alfresco nightly build has the capability right now with Chrome to upload folder. This is very interesting because in the incoming release will be officially released also to upload the folder inside Alfresco. I like to remember that on October 15, John Newton posted a relevant post about activity and the future of activity. We all know that activity during the last time has been some concern, let me say, but now the direction is straightforward and he's very clear to us. 16th of October with Boris Mejias retweeting Jeff Potts. We all know that Jeff Potts is one of the stars and a relevant member of the Order of the Bee about the helpful support of the community. Thank you guys, because this is very relevant for all of us. Axel Faust on 19th of October shared that the 71% of the attendance to a poll on the community portal decided that the number of hackathons right now planned, and remember they are 2 per year, are enough and are considered a good starting point, and are considered great to do. 21st of October, did you know that there are 8 hours of lectures, video, and hands-on labs on about activity in the university? I hope so. Another 24th of October with the virtual 4Ds. Of course, this is a reminder to always read the Order of the Bee tweets and to follow the Order of the Bee, of course. 26th of October, blog post from Dave Draper about the integration from REST API and Aikau. Martin Bergeon, the 26th of October, about getting started with Alfresco enterprise activity with a wonderful guide, as usual, from Martin Bergeon. Jeff Potts, how to declare the AMP and dependencies using Alfresco Maven SDK, 26th of October. Angel Borroy remembered to us the 29th of October that we have had a great office hours with Kristen about a tour on the community portal. And then the 31st of October, the release of the certification over activity. This is the very first time that this happened, and I think it's a relevant news for us. Don't forget to take a look at the new Magic Quadrant from Gartner, because lots of interesting stuff about Alfresco, because we left the visionary quadrant to be challenger. So very high ability to execute for us.
Hey, Francesca, yeah? Sorry to interrupt you. Were you going to be showing anything, or are you just going through the list? You're not screen sharing. I just want to make sure did you want to be screen sharing?
No, I think that probably, yes, probably there is something. No, sorry. Probably I didn't. Yes, I was not sharing the screen properly.
Not seeing your face, but I thought maybe you had something you wanted to show.
Okay, it's time. But thank you for saying that. But I was sharing something. Okay, right now, can you see right now?
There we go. There it is.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No, don't want to come back, of course. We will see the next time. Gavin, the 3rd of November with the part 4 of the REST API series right now is available. And Boris Mejias, 3rd of November, participated to the Postgres conference mentioning Order of the Year Alfresco 2. Mikhail Suzuki with a relevant test about Solar 6 over Alfresco, the 4th of November. This is a relevant news also for the future. And don't forget, the 4th of November, the activity release 5.22.0 from John Solar. Okay, sorry, first of all, for the misunderstanding. I didn't share correctly the screen, but this is the first time. I hope you enjoyed this turn. This is for communicating the news that I would like to show the next time. Now I stop again, and I stop the share the screen exactly, and I would like to, and I invite Dave to talk about the interesting topic about the content and the Aikau system. Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Francesco. Okay, let me make sure I get my screen sharing working as well, because that's obviously quite important. Can you all see?
Sure. Huh?
Is that showing up okay?
Yes, it works.
Okay, cool, brilliant. Okay, so yeah, I've done a few of these now, and most of the talks I've done have been on Aikau. So the challenge for me is always trying to come up with something fresh. I'm always aware I'm trying to talk to an audience that probably has been along for the ride, and also people who are brand new to it. So I'm just going to try and cover a lot of things. I'm going to go into a deep dive on widgets to try and, because I got some feedback on that area. I'm also going to talk about a little bit of the context about why we're here. And the first thing I want to talk about, and it really is very brief, is I want to talk about this idea of, well, I mean, versus is probably the wrong term, but if there's been a lot of conversation about ADF, we're very excited about it. It's something that's going to be very important for the future of Alfresco. And I think I have fed this back to management. I think we also need to not forget about the strengths of share, and also, and Aikau is obviously tied very, very intricately to that. So I'm not going to go through this, but there are some very, very obvious differences between Aikau and ADF. And the message really, and I'm hoping that Thomas DeMeo is going to reinforce this when he does office hours, is that Aikau is still very important to share, and share is still very important. There is ongoing development, and there was some chatter the other day, and there's sort of some misinformation suggesting that maybe development is stalled. I think it's fair to say that it slowed a little bit in 2016, but certainly throughout 2017 we're going to see more development going on. But yeah, so I just want to basically stress that yes, ADF is very important and we're very excited about it, but at the same time we shouldn't think that Aikau is disappearing and that share is no longer relevant, because we are continuing to invest in it and continuing to invest in Aikau. So just wanted to mention that very briefly, because I'm sure people are wondering about it. I also want to go a little bit of context about maybe if you're new to Aikau, and even it was quite interesting for me going back through this. How do we get to where we are effectively? So one of the questions people often have asked me in the past is, why doesn't Aikau use X, Y, or Z? And hopefully this is going to give you a little bit of context as to why. So effectively, way back in 2012, a few members of the UI team within Alfresco, as we were then, started looking into ideas for a new JS framework to sort of replace what we've been doing with UE2. We've been doing lots of work on Surf. We were looking to sort of move that, do more work in the front end area. And we sort of started looking around at it. And then in 2013, we started working with the activity guys around some Kickstart prototypes, but they then moved into a slightly different area, which is where we got a little bit of a split. But then in 2013, we had the 4.2 release, and this new framework, the first place it was being used on was on a new header page. And then in 2014, we decided to give the project the name Aikau. And then in 2014, again, we also did the 5.0 release, which was used for search, the search manager, and the sites manager. And I think there's this sort of, there's maybe a little bit of misconception that basically Aikau is very prevalent across the whole of Share, but it really isn't the case. Actually, the situation is that it's only used for a small part, but it's increasingly being used. So in 2015, the beginning of 2015, we extracted the code base from SVN and we moved it to GitHub, and we started on weekly releases. And then around about 5.1, we did a content model management was in 5.1, again, which Aikau is used for. And then we started to make use of Aikau in RM. So 2.3 was the first RM release at Aikau. And then in 2016, we've done some work on, I can't say a lot about this, but on a prototype client, which we've used to get some feedback from customers. 2016, again, we've done release RM 2.4 and 2.5, as well as the Alfresco content connector for Salesforce, which is a very key thing in terms of Aikau, because it's the first product that uses the Aikau version of the document library within it. So there's been a lot of work going on. This is kind of how we've got to right from the start to where we are today. But in terms of being able to develop anything in the web development area, it's incredibly complicated in terms of making decisions. So this is kind of a timeline I found online somewhere, giving an idea of development of frameworks. And roughly, this is over here is where Aikau work started. But you can see there's so much choice and it changes so frequently. And it's an incredibly difficult thing to know what to latch onto, and things have changed so much, certainly in the time frame that Aikau has been developed. So to give you an idea as well, this is some of the things that were at some frameworks. Obviously, this is not an exclusive list, but it gives you an idea of options that were available and certainly what was available around at the time. So we looked at things like jQuery and GWT and Dojo, with obviously some of the bigger players back then. UE3 we'd sort of rejected, but then things like Knockout and Backbone and even Angular 1. And those last two weren't even out of V1 when Aikau work started. So, there's a lot of these things, we just couldn't have adopted some of these things because they weren't mature enough, they weren't popular enough. And again, to give you another example, I looked up some blog posts that were from around 2012 when we started work, and you can see the kind of things that people were recommending. So yeah, there's things like Angular and Ember are mentioned in there, but there are other frameworks that effectively come and gone. So that it's really, I think everyone recognizes that web development is a very volatile area, and it's important that when the difference, I guess, between developing for a product like Alfresco, where you're looking for longevity, as opposed to sort of small, maybe client-facing operations where you're going in and just turning around short pieces of work, in that latter scenario, you can adopt and move from one thing to another. But with a product, you're looking to achieve some kind of longevity. So at the time, we went with Dojo, and really the main reason why we went with it was predominantly for the module loading capabilities. So this was going back to, I think, CommonJS was probably not well known at the time or in its infancy. There was no native modules in JavaScript at the time. So AMD, the asynchronous module definition, was really much the only game in town, and there were only options for that were Require.js and the Dojo AMD loader, and both of those were coming out of the Dojo Foundation. And we were very keen on this modular-based approach for only pulling in the sort of certain, the amount of code that we required. And similarly, it also offered us a very strong class-based framework to build on. Again, today you'd be looking at ES6 classes. Accessibility was and still is a very important thing for Alfresco, and Dojo had this baked into some of the widgets, so we could immediately leverage that support. And again, going back in to 2012, we were still very much supporting. I think it might even have been IE7 we were still supporting when we started, but nowadays you only have to support the evergreen browsers. But these were serious considerations at the time, and Dojo did have excellent support for those sort of for that browser normalization. And similarly, we were piggybacking again on top of a lot of the work we've done in terms of Surf, especially around resource aggregation. Again, today you're looking at things like Webpack or System.js, or maybe even in the future sort of an HTTP2 solution. But these options weren't available to us, and we put a lot of work into the aggregation capabilities in Surf. And the other key feature about it was this notion of dynamic customization, which is still very much based around Surf, which we still have to do to gain the features that we want to make use of. And so it's fair to say that, this slide gets shown around quite a lot, which is quite a funny one. But Aikau's never been particularly hot. But again, this gives you this idea of how the volatility of web development, and everything's moving on very quickly. And to sort of reinforce that, the recent state of JS came up, and they're talking about React and Vue.js being in the top, with Angular 2 sort of still having only just been released as somewhat an unknown quantity, with Angular and Ember falling away. And yet ThoughtWorks have just come out this week or last week maybe and said that actually Ember and React are the top ones to adopt. So it's almost an impossible choice to know what to adopt because things are moving so quickly. But the benefit that Aikau offers, and this is one of its strengths, is it does offer you this sort of protection against the churn. And this, I think, is one of the core strengths of Aikau, in that you're effectively writing to a user interface API, if you like. So you're writing these JSON models for your pages, and you're defining a contract. The contract is the widget configuration, and the implementation underneath that can change. And what this does is it means that we can actually change over time. So we can drop, although it was implemented for IE8, we can drop support by making use of other things. For example, we can now just use ES5 natively. We can use things like Flexbox as they're coming in, which weren't available to us. So even though a page that you wrote for Aikau 1.0.0 will still work today, because you've written a page based on the contract of the widgets that were available at the time, and we continue to honor those the configuration that we declare in a backwards compatible way. So the backwards compatibility is the biggest thing. We do these weekly releases. We've done just 94 of them to date. And again, what it gives you is it gives you this consistency. So as the older pages which we wrote against older releases of Aikau are continuously brought forward, so they inherit the bug fixes and the design enhancements and the performance updates. And we've done this already with things like buttons, which have changed their styling, and breadcrumbs, which we've rewritten once and we'll probably rewrite again. So you could use a breadcrumb in an older version, and it will still, what you used before will still be hold true in a more recent upgrade, even though the styling may change. And where we add new features, we take an opt-in approach. So the default behavior is always what it was. And if we introduce a new feature in a new release, then you have to opt in to make use of that. And that's how we can ensure backwards compatibility. And again, we've done this with lists. We've completely rewritten list rendering once, and forms. We've done a lot of change in forms, but all the time we've done it in a backwards compatible way. So we're able to take it, like I said, it protects you against that churn that's been happening over the last few years. And again, it's very important to understand how the different sides of this equation view Aikau. So we as Alfresco, we want to provide fine-grained customization in Share. But as a user, you just want to implement that customization. You probably aren't interested in allowing other people to customize what you're providing. And we want to avoid big rewrites. but maybe you want to take advantage of the latest technologies. And we wanted to, and this is an important one for us as well, with a small engineering team, we wanted to constrain the engineers working on the UI to those who were the real specialists. And we did this quite successfully with the Salesforce connector, for example, because those guys that were responsible for delivering the UI weren't UI developers. Whereas, you know, if you at the end of the day just want to get the job done, I mean, no, you want to put hacks in or anything, but you just want to get the job done, you maybe don't have those constraints. And we want to do release frequently, whereas maybe you want to have a stable base. So when you look at how we're delivering Aikau, we're trying to solve a lot of problems. And there's two different sides of looking at how things are being delivered, both from what we're delivering and from how you're consuming it. And in order to achieve the common goals, there has to be sort of some compromise, I guess, on what you can and can't use. And that leads us on to another point, which is the pub-sub model, which I think is one of the more complex areas of Aikau conceptually to understand. But just to give you an idea of why we've taken this approach, and again, I'm not going to talk about this in a huge amount of detail, but it's an important thing to understand that what it gives you is it enables us to decouple widgets from each other. So in a customization, you can remove one widget without breaking, you know, because there's no fixed references, so you don't get errors in the console. We can also decouple widgets from services, so we can maximize reuse. So a list is a list regardless of the data it renders. And you know, we can also test widgets as effectively a black box, where the publications and the subscriptions become the inputs, and it makes unit testing these widgets very easy. So that's kind of why we've done it, just to give you some context around Aikau, how we've got to where we are, and what it is we're trying to provide. But just a quick reminder before I go on, Aikau is on GitHub as opposed to SVN. We very much welcome community contributions. We're doing these weekly backwards compatible releases, and we have a bug-first mentality. So regardless of where they come from, if a bug comes in, it doesn't have to be from a paying customer. If it's a community member, we will focus on those bugs that don't get swept under the carpet. And we take a test-driven development approach. We're very much geared around doing things properly in an agile way, and trying to be best of breed software development. But this, again, in terms of how we do things, it's an interesting question, is what's actually happened to the Aikau team? Because if you've been following development, you might have seen a few changes. So the OS was effectively, we were a two-man team for the best part of 18 months. But sadly, things have changed. Martin Doyle, who was my colleague in the team, has now moved on. And I've actually moved into a more dedicated share team. So although I'm still managing the Aikau project as before, I'm moving to a more of a Kanban approach than Scrum. So although we used to do the releases, you know, Tuesday at 2 o'clock on the sort of in Tuesday afternoons on the dot, now we sort of release as necessary, but it's still typically on a weekly basis. So that's kind of where we were, and just to give you an insight of sort of things of where we might be going to. So we have a possible roadmap. I mean, this is possible because it's, you know, nothing's really set in stone. We haven't talked a lot about this, but just to give you an idea of where we could be taking Aikau, there's certainly a number of performance improvements we can make. We've one of our community members, Axel, has done a great job in pointing out some of these issues, and I've actually got a branch where I've resolved a lot of problems, but I'm just looking to merge that back in, so we know that we can work on in performance improvements. Now that we're dropping support for the older browsers, we can look to remove some of our JavaScript styling and adopt things more like Flexbox. So although we'll either rewrite the widget implementation, or we may provide alternative layout widgets and take advantage of some of these capabilities that are now available to us. Again, there's a strategic move towards material design, so you might see us starting to implement new widgets that are based around material design, or alternatively convert existing widgets to have more of a material design look and feel. But that will have to be done in accordance with changes in share. I've been doing a lot of work around forms runtime mapping, which is being able to render the XML forms configuration, which is defined in share, and mapping that to Aikau form controls. And there's a lot of blog posts on that and some examples, and if I have time at the end, I'll actually show some of these running. And in addition to that, we can look to start adopting some of these V1 REST APIs that are coming through, and again, adopt more ES6 support, which is going to be an interesting scenario because some of the browsers have very good native support for ES6, such as Chrome, but we might start to look at introducing things like Babel into Surf, which would require sort of node integration, maybe via something like J2V8, and also maybe alternatives to supporting modules with like things like maybe Webpack and System.js, and maybe even longer term than that. There's the option of looking at this is ultimately where modular-based web development is going, is to looking at things like ES6 modules and HTTP2 with that sort of multiplexing support that it gives you, and being able to take away some of the issues that currently exist. But these are all things that we could quite conceivably build into Surf and build into Aikau whilst still retaining the backwards compatibility that we have now. Another one might be, again, this is something we could look at doing, is trying to adopt some kind of Flux implementation, like maybe Redux, something like that, which is very popular in React. So those are things that we could be doing. More specifically around share, and like I said, we've been having, I can't talk too much about what we've been doing, but we've been starting to have some meetings about what we're going to be doing. But the general message is, and hopefully people will get this reference, Kristen is the only person who got it so far, but effectively it's going to be more Aikau, or in this case more cowbell. And if you're not familiar with this particular Saturday Night Live sketch, I urge you to watch it. But yeah, so what we're looking at is more of the Aikauification that Thomas DeMeo has talked about in the past. You should start to see more of that coming through, not in the release of the next release of Alfresco, but certainly the one after that. Okay, so a quick pause for breath.
Sorry, Dave, to interrupt you, but I would like only to share and to remember to everyone that a few weeks ago we had a precise request to understand better which is the roadmap of share and which is the relation, the supposed relation with ADF. I think that with this introduction, I think that this is more than an introduction. It's more than a short message. So it's an articulating message. It's a deep message about which is the roadmap for share and what we are going to do on share. What do you think?
Well, yes. I mean, I think that message has to really come from the product management team, and I'm hoping that Thomas is going to talk more about that when he does his office hours. There's only so much I can really talk about at the moment. I think that I'll leave that to Thomas, really.
Yes, sure. And just to share with all of us that next February probably we are planning to have a new office hour with Thomas DeMeo describing exactly the new general roadmap of Alfresco. Right, Kristen?
Yep, we haven't locked the date down with Thomas yet. His schedule is a bit mad, but the plan is, yeah, for definitely to start doing more regular roadmap discussions.
Yeah, I think the main thing. Oh, sorry.
Please go ahead.
The main thing I was going to say to take away from this is that people shouldn't get the idea that share is an Aikau development is in any way moved into maintenance mode or anything like that. There is active work still going on. It's important to the company. And although there hasn't been a lot of noise made about it, that doesn't mean it's not still happening.
Yes, sure, definitely. And it is very relevant also that all the presentation I started to see inside the organization, Alfresco organization, describe exactly that share has its own path because it has a huge quantity, a huge amount of feature ready to go. And of course, ADF is on the right path to become something to create verticals and to create custom application. So we are on the track to do a complete job. And I think the Gartner recognition to be more able to, with a higher ability to execute depends on the existing of share and ADF together in the same product.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, Dave.
Okay, no, that's fine. So if there's nothing that's come up on IRC, that I'll go into some of this more of this deep dive for the second part of the session. So what I wanted to do was effectively just go through some of the issues, or not issues necessarily, but some of the general things that maybe come up when you're looking at defining widgets. So this is something you might see, this kind of style in an Aikau widget, or when you're writing your own. And I think sometimes there's a little bit of confusion about what this kind of thing means. This is what you'd see at the beginning, but this is how you declare dependencies for a module way. So the idea being is that your widget is only going to have access to the resources that you've explicitly say that it wants to have. So what you might find here is that you're defining an array of resources to load, and then you're passing the modules defined in them into a callback function. So here you can see we're placing a request on dojo/base/declare for declare, which is ultimately declares our module, and we're passing it into the callback function, and then this declare will be then available for use. So if you're more familiar with ES6 concepts, this is approximately how the lines above would translate. So you're basically saying import everything as this declare object from this particular resource. So really, if you conceptually understand module loading, it's just a little bit of boilerplate code, I guess, to understand how it is that you define your dependencies and what it is you want to load into your widget. So again, I think this is something that comes up occasionally and people get a little bit confused with. But yeah, once you understand the pattern, it's pretty straightforward. So each of the things you define, you then just pass into the callback. And in terms of CSS and localization, so what Surf actually does is when we define these pages as a model, and they get passed into Surf, and then Surf will actually analyze the source of every widget, every module, and build like a dependency tree. And within that, you can actually define these arrays of CSS requirements. So if I just switch to here's an example here. So this is a label widget which exists. Hopefully, we just made this a little bigger so it shows up okay. But here you can see right at the beginning we define this I18 requirements and CSS requirements, and you can actually define all of the things that you want to load in, and we normally define them as being relative to the widget. And again, that's the I18 requirements is for localization. So these are just properties files. These are just, well, technically they're less files because they go through a less preprocessor. You can actually define more than one dependency, and dependencies are inherited. So for example, although for this widget, any CSS files that are actually in the dependency tree. So I actually didn't say this. So where you declare a widget, I should have mentioned this. The first element is what it extends directly, and the others are mixed in. So any requirements that are defined in any of the mix-ins will also be included in the page. So you don't have to duplicate references to other things. They're always inherited. And the localization. So when you want to use one of these things, again, if I jump in here, there's probably one in here. This example, when you use localization, you call this.message, and this will actually hunt through from the most specific to the least specific, if you like. So it will look first in property files which are scoped to the widget, then to any of the widgets that it inherits from, or modules it inherits from, and then to the web script that's rendering the page, and then also to the global messages. So although in here the best practice would not be to duplicate message keys, it is possible to reuse message keys if you want to. We would advise not to do that, but it can be done. And you can sort of individually scope a widget, which again we don't typically do, but it is there if you want to. And CSS can also be media specific, which again is not something we typically do, but in here, for example, where you say CSS, you could just actually have an additional attribute, which is media, and then it will only be loaded for that. It just as a media directive works in CSS. That's exactly the same principle. So it would be dependent upon where it's being run. And also, again, in CSS, your CSS files, you can use less variables. So I should be able to give you an example of that somewhere. Hopefully I can find one. I should have picked one up. But here you can see an example from the same widget. This is the CSS associated with this label. You can see where we've got these values. We're actually picking up information from our own defaults.less file, which I'll actually open up as well. You can here see we define all of these CSS attributes, and you can actually pick from them, and then these can be overridden on a theme by theme basis. So you can, so by referring to the less variables, you can actually write your widget in a way which will be consistent with the theme that that Share is using, and it might not even be a theme that you yourself have written. So that's just to understand how these dependencies are pulled together for a widget. And then in the actual widget itself, because we build on widget base, which is a Dojo module, we get a basic widget lifecycle, and that's effectively a constructor to create it. And then the ones that are really interesting is post-mixing properties, which is where you set up stuff prior to rendering, build rendering, where it actually renders the DOM, post-create, which is what it calls after the DOM has been created, and then finally the startup method. But as a general rule, you basically just need to worry about post-mixing and post-create. And again, I can show an example of this kind of thing here. So this is a property renderer. We've got post-mixing properties, and what we're doing here is we're actually setting up a bunch of attributes which we need to be in place before we render the DOM mode. And then we've also got a post-create call, which is called after the model has been accessed, and we can then do things like apply additional classes to the elements which we now have a reference to, because it's then been built. And then that leads me on to templating, which is that is done by the build rendering, which is why you typically don't need to call it. And this is done when you use digit templated mixin, which again is a mixin module which basically implements build rendering for you. And what it does is it allows you to define a template. So again, an example of that. So in this property, here's an example of it. This would be by using templated mixin, you can define a simple HTML element, and then it allows you to sort of drop in using this token substitution idea properties from your widget that you will have set up in post-mixing properties. And you've got things like being able to set an exclamation mark, or I think a bang it's sometimes referred to actually say don't encode this. So by default these would be automatically encoded, but you can set this to not be encoded. You have to be obviously very careful with that with regards to XSS vulnerabilities. But that's something you can do if you want to. That would allow you to, for example, to render HTML inside the value. But again, you should use caution when doing that. So what you do here is you can attach events, and you can create references to elements within the DOM. So you can see that going on here. This attach point is basically saying, by assigning this rendered value node, it means I then have a reference to that within the widget. So I can then call this.rendered value node, and that gives me access to it. Similarly, another one, slightly more complex model here, similar kind of thing, is that you can do attach events. So using this data dojo attach events, you can do on key press, on click, all that kind of normal sort of standard thing you can do. It's very similar to other templating engines, but these are the things you can do. You can attach events and attach points, as they call them, and also define attributes which you want to render. But it's not necessary to use the Dojo rendering capabilities. At some point in the future, we might start moving away from that and taking advantage of other rendering engines. You just basically need to take responsibility for build rendering yourself by overriding it, or by just not including this mixin. So that's then giving you the idea of how to build your basic widget. But obviously, the whole idea of Aikau is having these nested trees of widgets. So one of the important things is for a parent to be able to create child widgets. So the way you do this is you mix in. There's a dedicated module called core widget processing, and what this gives you access to a function which is called process widgets, and that allows you to process a sub model, if you like, of widgets to render as children. And the life cycle of this is basically for each widget in the model, it calls process widget. It creates the DOM node for it. It actually creates these two I think are in the wrong order, but it basically sets up the config and then creates the widget. Then it registers each widget as it's created, and finally there's this callback called all widgets processed, which you can then hook into. So once all of the children that you're defining have been created, you can then use this callback function, or actually basically it's an extension point that we provide to hook in, so you can then do things with the child widgets as necessary. And we also provide this optional process widgets ID now. I think I got an example of this somewhere. I can't remember if I put this in anywhere. I was opening up a few things, but the idea being that you can have a specific identifier for the widgets so for the model you build. When I first came up with this, I was assuming each children really have one group of children, but then increasingly found that a widget might want to have different hierarchies of children, and we needed to be able to identify those. So there's this additional thing you can pass in and basically say, when all widgets processed or any of the functions in the stack are called, you can actually look at this ID and say, is this when I was creating buttons, for example, or the list, or whatever it is you passed in when you said, right, create these widgets. Because it's all done asynchronously, you can't guarantee the order in which these things are going to come back. So that's something to be aware of. But the key thing is that it's very important to, when you're using this approach, is to clone your widgets before use. And again, we might swap this out for a different implementation at some point, but there's a lang.clone function which is available. And what this does is it means it takes as the name suggests, it does a clone of the model. And the reason why you want to do this is because when you actually build that widget or you process that widget model, you don't want the original model to be populated with any data which is then reused. And this is most importantly with regards to publication subscription scopes, which can then cause issues. So before you do this kind of thing where you're going to call process widgets, you want to make sure you take a clone of the model before you do it. That's very important. And every time a parent creates a child, it will pass on, or the child will inherit in attributes if they've been set. So the main one and the most important one of these is one called current item, and this really exists. It's like the contextual item of what you're working with, and this is very important when you're dealing with things like lists, because it's iterating the same. The widget model for each item is iterated over, but the current item is changing, and you can use this value for things like when you're clicking on it, you might derive data from what to do based on the current item, or it might actually determine whether or not even to render or change its behavior based on what the current item is. And typically this would be the metadata of a node. And similarly, there's also a current metadata object. This will get inherited, which is effectively the overarching data about all of the current items. This is also known as current data in lists, which is an unfortunate inconsistency, but one of those things that's crept in that you just need to be aware of. Also, it will inherit any group memberships, which is something you should set, which basically gives you access to all of the group information on the current user, as well as any privileges that user has, such as whether it's an admin or one of the various types of admin, and you can use this for handling rendering. The pub subscope is inherited, as is the parent pub subscope if one exists. So a child widget will always have the same publication subscription scope as its parent, up until the point where it declares it wants to have set a new scope, and it will also have a parent pub subscope if one is available. And finally, there's a data scope, because Aikau actually offers some data binding out of the box, although again we don't make heavy use of it, but that will also be inherited from parent to child, the child will inherit from the parent. And what you can do with things like this is you can start building up render filtering. So render filtering is where or not the parent determines whether or not it wants to actually render the children. And this is a very important thing because it allows you to define conditional rendering based on logic determined by all sorts of factors. So the parent determines whether or not to render its children. The rules are defined on the child, but the attributes are actually evaluated on the parent, and as I've said, this is done on the current item by default, but you can actually change it to use any target. And this is where something like group memberships comes into play, because then you can start to do role-based rendering. So you might only provide links, or certain widgets are rendered if the user is an admin or a member of a certain group, etc. So this gives you complete flexibility within your widgets and within your page models. And so I can actually show you this in an example. So what we've got, hopefully people are familiar with the Aikau Sandpit, which is, and again, an Aikau built application in which you can, which we've started to put samples of how to use things. And there's actually an entire page just dedicated to render filters. And it's got a very good example of each type has got a description showing what it does, and with a little model fragment showing how it might be used. So we've got examples of being able to say, right, based on this, because you can actually define the current item as well. So we're saying if the property of X has a value in this array, then it's going to get rendered, and clearly it does. And you can say, you can use things like, instead of just values, it could be contains, which is to address array objects, and you can do contains all, so it's has to be you know, you can read this on your own time, but basically you can do all sorts of cool things with its token substitutions, and you can negate the rules. And as these SAMP examples go through, they get more and more complex. And you can kind of see that from here, the output either has something in it or it doesn't, which is just entirely based on how the rules have been processed. So that's kind of an important concept to get your head around, and I would recommend looking at there's some blog posts on it, and also going through that SAMPit. That's very good resource for education. And similarly, the converse of that is this dynamic visibility configuration, which is where the widget is always rendered, but you can actually dynamically toggle whether or not it's displayed. And again, this is all done over a publication subscription model, and this allows you to sort of you know, make things appear and disappear. So I can actually show some concrete examples of that actually. So for example, in the search page, which we have rendering here, you can see certain things are going to be difficult to show. So okay, for example, there's an actual sort order. If I change the sort order here, you can see that I now have the ability to toggle the order. I only see that for some of the elements because I've got a visibility config which is looking at the attributes that are available. And similarly, if I'm going to try and put let me see if I can search for something that's not going to exist. So certain things that are hidden based on the topics that are being published. So that gives you an example of how you might use this as concrete example. And again, there's a SAMPit example for this as well, which is again similarly worth looking at. So it's visibility config, and you can use this SAMPit, and you know, this shows the example of, you know, as I'm changing, things are being published. It's showing this is a form-based example, but again, you've got things like as I'm publishing events, stuff's happening, and you can see that it's all just defined in this static model here. And you've got all sorts of other things, like you can configure invisibility instead of visibility. You can use the current item for data, and you can actually have sort of state-based things where it tracks multiple things. So I have to click both these items for something to be rendered. So again, so visibility config, or the dynamic aspect of that, can also be quite a powerful feature when and again, you can use these both within your widgets, within your widget models, and in your page models as well. So again, I know this is I just want to get in, you know, make people aware of these things, and those SAMPit examples are certainly good places to start looking.
Sorry, Dave. A question from the IRC. Could you please tell something more about the Aikau Sandbit, because you mentioned that it's a very good resource for education, and I wrote a question in the IRC asking if everyone knows Sandbit. Aikau Sandbit is not exactly known, without of course moving the discussion, but can you talk a little bit more about the Sandbit?
Yeah. Certainly. So the SAMPit, if you go to the Aikau GitHub page, there's actually it's actually a dedicated application which is defined here, and it always is running the latest version of Aikau. It's got a bit of information here, and what we were hoping for really is for people to actually start contributing pages, which is it's all defined how you would do that, but to provide simple examples of how to use it. But the URL is basically Aikau-Sandbit alfresco.com, and then you get into here, and this is again, it's all rendered with Aikau, so you can actually just search for things like filtering. It's just sort of showcasing some of the things it can do. And then, for example, you can go and look at things, and it provides a number of snippets. And the idea is that you can you know, you can just update things. So for example, I can go in here and I can actually say, right, so if I give this a label, make sure I've got it rendered correctly, you can see that now I've got a label, and you can actually play around with this stuff. You get the idea, though. You can actually just the idea, you just want to be able to play with stuff. But we try to use it as an educational tool, but it's there. We'd like people to make contributions to it, and as I said, we try and provide we sort of go through. We're showing here again, like how you put, you know, different things in. So I thought I've mentioned it previously. If people aren't aware of it, that's a shame. Hopefully people can become more aware of it now, because I think, like I said, it can be very useful. Ideally, we'd like people to provide pages as well, It's just, it's a much more open contribution process than Aikau itself, which has got some quite strict acceptance criteria, but it does give you an idea of, there's very small examples of things. So you can see that this is showing that, we've got a required field, so when the data's there, the forms are hidden, and things like the form one is really useful because it gives you all sorts of information on validation and all kinds of things like that. So yeah,
Dave, I can confirm what you say, because two feedback from the IRC channel tells that looks cool, first of all, and even if someone is not a pure web developer, and the Aikau framework is not so easy, they found it really straightforward and understandable to do things.
Okay, well that's really good. That's the idea. I mean, like trying to break things down into smaller pieces, and like I said, if people have any examples they want to contribute just as a page, like, hey, you can do this or whatever, then we'd love to have them. It's all good. So if people are interested in doing that, then definitely. So yeah, I'll tweet the link again maybe after this, just so people can find it and have a play with it and explore.
Nice.
I'm aware that I'm been running out of time, so I'll try and crack through the rest of these things, but I wanted to show a few more things. So one of the other key things when you're building your children is that you want to use this concept of object processing, which is available by this object processing mixin, and it's most commonly used in the publish payload mixin. And the idea is that you can do all these processing on a model before it gets rendered. So an example of this might be, I had one open here, so there's a dedicated test for publish payload mixin. This is just one of our test pages. And what you can see is that, let me find a good example. So here we've got publish action widget, and we define modify. We say that the type is process, which makes use of this processing capabilities. Then we say that the modifiers we want to apply, and then we can actually do things like token substitution, which are taken from the current item or the instance token. Oh, sorry, the instance. The instance value or anything else, and there's all these different things that are available. And just as we've got the sandpit, if you build the unit test, let me just see if I can find it. You build the unit test application, which is very similar to the sandpit, except this is actually what we use to do our testing in. You can actually go and look at these things. So and they're not supposed to be, these aren't supposed to be useful in the same way, but they are good examples of sort of when you click on things. And this is our debug logging, which we're going to talk about debugging in a minute, but you can see that as I click on each of these things, I can actually go and look at the data that's being published. And you can see that it's deriving the payload data from, it's doing token substitution, and it's doing all sorts of things on the data in order to be able to manipulate the object. And so what you'll see is in something like this, where what we'll then typically maybe do is we'll say, right, take a widget model, and then we'll clone that, and then we'll do some processing on it to actually substitute any substitution points that we might have, and then we'll actually call process widgets, and we'll actually build that. So it just gives us a lot more flexibility on how we build our models. So again, a very useful feature. I would certainly, I think that we've let me just say again, if you're not familiar with it, if you look at the Desire.js documentation page, publish payload mixin, I think again you can go and look at something like this, and it's got some great examples of how you can use these things and how you can configure them. So if you again another useful resource, if you want to if you look at how any of our documentation on here and you feel it's lacking in some way, then either please make a pull request to improve it, or just let us know and we'll try and improve it, because we obviously want to make our educational resources as good as they can be. And then the only other thing to be aware of is you do get, there's a sort of limited by nesting capabilities. So if you have one widget that's processing and it has widgets within it which might try and process, if they're trying to process the same object, you can get things swapped in unexpectedly. So you just need to be a bit careful with nesting. Some general tips: you always want to mix in Alfresco core because that provides all your logging and pub sub capabilities. If you want to add in additional CSS classes, there's always this attribute which you can define on any widget, and that will actually just include some additional CSS classes to tie into your own CSS maybe, or for testing purposes, or for anything else you want to do. can always call generate UUID if you're looking to create a unique identifier, which we do quite a lot. Didn't talk about this before, but you can also use non-AMD dependencies to define lists of things, that third-party packages that aren't provided as AMD modules. jQuery is available by default out of the box, and jQuery UI. Let me see if I can find an example of that in the code base. Let me see here. Normally, so what you normally do is, here's an example of it. You can just literally reference it. So we reference it as being just jQuery. Remember what I talked to you about earlier, as a dependency, and then the callback. Either we do it as the, I mean, I pass it as jQuery there. That's probably not the best example. In other ones, we've actually done it where, again, we've got jQuery and jQuery UI being pulled in. Here's a better example where we more traditionally match it to the dollar symbol, which and then you just use it as you would use jQuery. So don't be afraid to use jQuery. I mean, don't be afraid to use any other JavaScript framework. As I said, although we use a lot of Dojo, we use other frameworks as well. And you can certainly pull in almost anything that you want to. I did blog posts recently on using Vue.js with it, and there's an Angular 2 integration which I've demonstrated, and I might look at showing React integration as well. Other cool things that you might want to use is Dojo/on, which is for custom event generation. So you don't have to slavishly use the pub sub mechanism. If you have some widgets where you want events to bubble out, you can define. You can use this on.on-knit for custom events. And another useful feature is Dojo aspect, where you can actually have call code before, after, or entirely around other functions that are being used, and that can be a very powerful capability as well. So again, I know Dojo is not the most, the coolest framework out there, but it does have some very powerful features when you're developing your widgets. So I would recommend looking into what it does have to offer and just not rejecting it out of hand, because there is some cool stuff that you can make use of. So I know I'm really running out of time, but I was going to talk about 2 minutes on debugging. So very, very, very quickly. So if you want to do debugging, here's I've got share running here. The quickest way to get to your surf code is if you open up the developer tools, do Control P, or I think it's Command P if you're on a Mac, and if you just type surf and hit return, this will always give you the aggregated resource, because some people have said, we'd like source maps is something which would have been nice to have put in, but we haven't done it. But this gives you access to all the aggregated resource. And if you wanted to, so for example, find something, normally you can find it very easily by the function name. So you can sort of search for code, and this is normally what I do. And then you can then sort of put breakpoints and stuff in as you normally would, and this would then actually get triggered. So actually, let me find a better one than that. So if I was going to search for menu item victim, so if I click, there's an on-click function here. I think hopefully if I was to click on something here, for example, it should hit the right. So you can see that it's hitting the breakpoint in the on-click method. So that's normally the quickest way I find of hitting breakpoints in the code. And you can then, once you're into the developer tools, you can use it just in the normal way you would. The other thing you can do as well is in the debug menu. If you enable client debug to be true in your share config code and then restart, you get access to this debug menu, and then you get other things like being able to enable debug logging and controlling what's actually shown, and you can even actually set preferences of filters for what actually comes out, and then you will see these logs coming out here. Since we did this, actually the filtering in Chrome is actually better than it was originally, so you can use the filtering in here as well to look for specific log messages. And then the other thing which you saw in the unit test is that we've actually got this pub sub log as well, and in here as well you can actually so let me just try and think what might be in here. Let's, like, for example, exclude node resized, but you can see that all of these widgets, these things are in here. You can just turn off publications and look at the subscriptions, or just look at the publications, and you can then look at what's actually been published, and you can clear it and do all this kind of stuff. So this is another useful resource when debugging as well. So there's a couple of very quick tips. And 2 very quick appeals. I was going to get to show some demos, but I've run out of time. So an appeal for testing. So Axel has asked if there's anyone would like to go through the setup for the setting up the unit test application test to see if they can get them running, because I've been able to do it, and I've actually gone and done a whole video showing it from start to scratch, from beginning to end of setting up a test environment. But we'd really like to get some more feedback on this, because Axel's had a lot of issues and we want to get to the bottom of what's happened. So if there are any volunteers who want to do that, it would be greatly appreciated. And also a general appeal for feedback. We want your use cases. What is it you're trying to build with Aikau and can't? We want pull requests for changes. We want tell us about bugs. We're really keen to know where, if you hit an issue, tell us about it. Don't just ignore it. We need to know in order to improve Aikau and make it better. And we want to know about your experiences as well in general. How are you finding it? What could be improved? Any feedback you can give us is invaluable. So I would really appreciate that. Haven't got time for demos, but I was just going to show a lot of the stuff which I'd shown on blogs previously. Maybe I'll be able to do that another time. But if you haven't seen my blog posts, then please, you can follow me on Twitter, or you can find all my content on the community platform, which is a really good resource. I recommend you sign up if you haven't, and you can look at the blog content, and there's all sorts of demos and things like that I've done. And that's it. And I'm kind of aware that I've sort of used up too much time, I think, maybe. Let me stop my screen sharing and go back to, yeah. So that's me. I hope that's been useful for people.
Really, Dave, just a feedback for you, and then I leave the message. I leave everything for Kristen. From the ARC, lots of enthusiasm for seeing you work on the code. So I think we have to repeat, because this is not an invitation for us. Thank you for me, and thank you from me, and thank you for all the developers that are available in the ARC channel.
Yep. Thanks to everybody for coming. I know we're kind of out of time on this one. Dave is in the community a lot, and we linked to his blogs on the IRC chat, or you can just follow him personally on the community to see any new content he contributes. So be sure to check out Dave on the platform. Our next meeting will be on the 17th of November. That's a Thursday. We normally do a Friday, but because of scheduling, we're backing up to Thursday, and that will be with John Sott about activity. So we'll post that content in the community as well. And yeah, thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.